This first chapter is going to provide an overview of sex offenses and offenders. Incidents of sexual offending have been decreasing over the last 2 decades, while at the same time sanctions for sex offenders have been increasing. These increased sanctions have occurred despite the fact that research does not show that sanctions significantly deter offenders or reduce recidivism. Moral panics about sexual abuse have occurred throughout history, and there are few groups that are hated more than sex offenders. In the 80s and 90s, we had several high-profile, emotionally charged cases that involved children as victims of sexual abuse. And this reignites the public's intolerance for sex offenders. One thing to keep in mind is that how we perceive sex offenders is a result of socially constructed realities. So if you think back to Introduction to Sociology or Deviance and Social Control, we want to think about how some things are social constructs. It's not that there's an objective reality, but society has defined certain behaviors in certain ways. And these socially constructed realities are influenced by existing social and political ideologies. Another thing to keep in mind is that sex offenders are not a heterogeneous population. They are a heterogeneous population. They're not a homogeneous population. So we cannot treat all sex offenders the same way, and one-size-fits-all policies will not work. Research today in this field focuses on factors associated with sexual offending. So what are personal characteristics or situations that are related to sex offending? The risk of recidivism, so how likely is it that sex offenders will reoffend? And how effective are policies that we have in place? So let's start by defining what is a sexual offense. In 1886, Kraft-Ebing wrote of condemned sexual practices, and what we've considered to be sex offenses have really evolved over time. So early on, this included things like homosexuality, masturbation, and these were things that were considered to be both loathsome and pathological. Attitudes toward sexual behavior are sociological constructs and political ideologies. So these are not things that are necessarily innate, but we have constructed whether or not we see things as deviant. So if you go back to this early definition by Kraft-Ebing, we see masturbation and homosexuality, and today we don't consider those to be condemned sexual practices. What is considered legally and socially acceptable in terms of boundaries for sexual behavior is not always clear. And sexual violence is also not unique to certain cultures. So sexual behavior that doesn't lead to procreation has vacillated. It's sort of gone back and forth between being accepted, being stigmatized, and being legal. So what are some categories of sexual acts that may turn out to be criminalized? Sexual acts with contact. So this is most sexual offenses. This is when we have any sort of touching of intimate parts or penetration without consent. There's non-contact sexual behavior. So this is behavior done for the purpose of sexual gratification, and it does not involve contact between the perpetrator and victim. Viewing, possessing, or producing child pornography. This is visual material of a child whose purpose is to sexually gratify an adult. And then finally, sexual solicitations or trafficking. These are sexual services exchanged for financial or other compensation. Some offenses are common across all jurisdictions, although the terminology may be different. So rape generally refers to non-consensual oral, anal, or vaginal penetration. North Dakota, for example, calls it sexual imposition or gross sexual imposition, whereas Colorado calls it sexual assault. Definitions also vary in terms of who can be a victim or an offender, class, and age of victim. Some behavior that's also consensual is labeled as criminal. So if you think about statutory rape, right, this is when someone has sex under the age of consent. So the person may actually be consenting to the behavior, but the law has considered them unable to consent. So until 2003, 13 states held consensual sodomy to be criminal, and this happened until the Supreme Court case of Lawrence v. Texas. Other consensual behavior in the past that's been labeled as criminal includes incest, adultery, bigamy, female genital mutilation, fornication, masturbation for hire, indecent dancing, prostitution, and public indecency. Some crimes are also registerable offenses, meaning the offender would have to register for the sex offender registry list upon a conviction, that are not sexual in nature. So kidnapping in some states would require you to register. Most offenses are looking for at least a lack of consent by the victim and some level of intent by the offender. So consent is lacking when the act is a result of force, threat, or duress, when a reasonable person would understand the victim did not consent. And again, we've talked just a moment ago about age. So people under certain ages in Massachusetts, the age of consent is 16. All states except Massachusetts and one other state have flexible laws of consent, which have to deal more with address things more like power differentials and age differences. Status can also make someone ineligible to consent. And offenses also are going to vary by type, degree of severity, class of offense, and length of sanction. So let's take a minute here to look at how prevalent is sexual offending and victimization. And this is impossible to accurately assess. This is a crime that is vastly underreported. Most data is derived from offenders who are arrested and or convicted, and this is a small portion of all offenders. So even when we have data or characteristics about offenders, it's based only on offenders that are known. So most sexual assaults are not reported, and then even amongst those, offenders are not always known. So from 1992 to 2000, for example, only 31% of rapes and sexual assaults were reported to the police. Because of the funnel system of the criminal justice system, the further we get through the system, the fewer people who are actually incarcerated. And nearly all data we do have on sex offenders is on male offenders. What we do know is that sex offending is fairly widespread. One meta-analysis found that overall rates of victimization throughout the lifetime is 30% for girls and 13% for boys. Finkelhor, who's a researcher out of UNH, found children who are abused often experience multiple types of abuse. So nearly 50% had experienced more than one form of direct abuse or indirect, where they're witnessing victimization. Indirect abuse is often also referred to as secondary victimization. So not only is this a criminal justice problem, but it's a public health problem. Children who are victimized show higher levels of mental health problems as adults. The problem is also exacerbated by low reporting rates and delays in disclosure. So people don't often disclose that they've been sexually assaulted right away. And whether or not there's a delay in disclosure is related to things like what's the relationship between the victim and offender, how severe is the incident, what are the consequences of disclosing, age and developmental variables play a role as well. And also for some offenders, especially children, there's a lot of grooming behavior used by offenders. Compared with males, females are more likely to be sexually assaulted during childhood, and they're more likely to disclose than males are. There is more data on boys emerging, especially when we're talking about abuse within institutional settings. But we don't know a lot about the long-term effects for male victims. So our primary sources of information about sex offenders and rates of victimization come from official data. So the UCR, the NIBR, the NIBRS, and also empirical studies, research that's been done by researchers. So what does official data tell us? Well, UCR uses the same definition from year to year, although the definition of rape changed several years ago. UCR defines rape as penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. And attempts are included here as well. Statutory rapes and other sex offenses are not included here. Some other sex offenses are included in Part 2 of the UCR, but statutory rape is only included in NIBRS. So for 2009, there were 56.6 rapes per 100,000 people. NIBRS has eliminated the hierarchy rule and has much more detailed data. And they do provide information on statutory rape. We also do surveys of victims and asking people about whether or not they've been a victim of a crime. So in the NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Survey, attempts to get at the dark figure of crime, which is the amount of the crime that's not reported to the police. Only about 40%, just under 40% of crime is reported to the police. There's no significant differences here based on race or ethnicity between the NCVS and the UCR. The highest rate of victimization is 16 to 19-year-olds, followed by 20 to 24, and then 12 to 15. The NCVS doesn't collect data on victims under the age of 12, so we don't have any data on that. 52% of males were abused by non-strangers, but this is a small sample, and so it's probably not very representative. Whereas nearly 70% of females were abused by non-strangers. So overwhelmingly, people are generally abused by someone they know. Minnesota did a student survey with 6th, 9th, and 12th graders, which had 2 questions about sexual assault. And this showed a slight rise in abuse between 89 and 92, and then a 22% drop between 92 and 2001. There's a national incidence study, and this is a social service study, and it's mandated by Congress and carried out by the Department of Health and Human Services. And basically, they're making estimates of sexual assault based on both substantiated and unsubstantiated social service cases. This provides information on children, perpetrators, and families as well, and provides demographical information about the nature and severity of maltreatment. This uses sentinel methodology. It requires community professionals to look for victims or possible victims of child abuse and neglect. The NIS-4 collected data from 126 child protective service agencies in 122 counties. And then they were evaluated according to standard definitions of abuse and neglect. So they're looking for a harm standard, which we're seeing some demonstrable harm, and an endangerment standard. All of those in the harm standard, as well as those deemed endangered in their professional opinion. They found that 1 in 58 children experienced maltreatment, that there was a 26% decrease in the number of children sexually abused, and a 44% decrease in the rate of sexual abuse. Of the 29% of children who were abused, 22% of them were sexually assaulted. The National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System has case-specific data of all investigated reports of child maltreatment to state child protective service agencies. States, however, are not required to submit their data, so this data is incomplete. There's also no information for perpetrators in cases where the case was not substantiated. So that's sort of like substantiated versus unsubstantiated, and social services is sort of like cleared versus not cleared in criminal justice. These are cases where they weren't able to substantiate the case with any proof. Data from substantiated cases does include perpetrators' gender, race, and relationship to the child, and some information about support services that were offered. So in 1992, state-level rates of sexual assault ranged from 87 in New Jersey to 688 in Alaska. The average was 246 per 100,000 people in the population. What about research? Well, in the 80s, we see a rise in reporting of sexual assault by acquaintances. And these are those types of assaults that are least likely to be reported. And this started to really shatter these stereotypes and these images of what we thought sexual assault looked like. People most likely to be sentenced to prison are strangers, those who use a weapon, ones that have multiple minor victims, assaults that result in a physical injury, and people who've committed an additional offense. This is generally considered to be a psychologically motivated offense, and offenders could have anything from a personality disorder, they could suffer from a paraphilia, they may have poor social and relationship skills, poor relationships with their parents, many abuse alcohol and drugs, and many were abused themselves as children. Rates have declined in the past decade, as have crime rates in general, and sanctions, as I mentioned earlier, have been increasing. So sexual abuse is the most underreported offense. The NCVS tells us victims over the age of 12 are more likely to report if the offender is male, black, between the ages of 12 and 14, if there's more than one perpetrator, if the offender is a stranger, if a weapon is present. The most common reason victims give for reporting is to prevent future violence, and the most common reason for not reporting is privacy concerns. Empirical research does support what the NCVS tells us as well. And the most common studies analyzing reporting trends on sexual abuse are adult retrospective studies. So we're interviewing adults and we're asking them to look back in their life about their experiences. Whether or not someone discloses childhood sexual assault depends on certain things. So about a third report it before the age of 18, but the average age of disclosure is nearly 26. The average age of child sexual assault victims is 8, and about 40% disclose when it actually occurs. The average age at time of abuse was 10, and nearly 2/3 of those victims disclosed as adults, and majority of them waiting more than 8 years to disclose. Disclosure can be spontaneous, where someone just discloses to you, or it could be prompted, where someone has asked some questions. With preschool age children, disclosure is more accidental, and with adolescents, it's more purposeful. There's some significant factors in disclosing, and the biggest one is whether or not the person to whom they first disclose believes them, or do they believe if that person will believe them. So it's really important if someone discloses something like this to you that you're open and supportive to them because that really impacts whether or not they disclose to anyone else. And about half of children who are victims disclose under pressure from their parents. So here's some things that are related to a delay in disclosure. First of all, does the abuse occur in private? Because this encourages secrecy from the abuser. Are these children who are generally obedient to adults? Because that helps the adult maintain secrecy. Does the child feel guilt and responsibility? Have they been promised secrecy? Do they have feelings of shame? And a lot of times victims will disclose and then recant. And that is because generally people do not believe them. Many also disclose in stages, beginning with denial that anything has happened to them, and then disclosure. A lot of times people recant and then they reaffirm. Adult retrospective studies can help us understand why disclosure is delayed. So the age of the victim at the time of the abuse. What is the victim-perpetrator relationship? And this is probably the most important one. So people are less likely to report female perpetrators. What is the gender of the victim and what is their cognitive ability? What type of abuse has occurred and what are the chances of negative consequences related to the disclosure? So basically, children need to feel as though they will be supported by the person to whom they disclose. And this is true also for teens and adults as well. One thing to think about is telescoping. And this is something that becomes a factor when we're looking at victim studies, self-report studies. So forward telescoping is that when we recall an event that occurred prior to the reporting period. So if I'm asking you about the year 2015 and something happened to you in 2014, but you're recalling it as happening in 2015. People also do this too, where they do backward telescoping. They're recalling an event that occurred after the reporting period. And this most often occurs in those who are 55 and older, with forward telescoping being the most common. So basically, if someone has not reported the sexual assault before, they're much more likely to telescope, which is to place the event in the wrong time period. So in order to counter this, the NCVS uses what's called bounded interviews. Interviews are conducted after a previous visit, and this allows them, and with the NCVS, these are done they're asked about every 6 months, and this provides better accuracy. And that wraps up this chapter on sexual offenses and offenders.